After my daughter sold her grandfather's ring and treated me like a maid, I decided to grant her wish and clean the house completely while she slept. She woke up on Christmas morning to find the furniture gone, the power cut, and a single note explaining that the foreclosure was now her problem. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The scent of Christmas in my Raleigh home used to be a specific, comforting alchemy of baking gingerbread, fresh pine from the tree in the corner, and the faint, clean smell of winter air. But this year, a new, discordant note had hijacked the symphony. The cloying, fruity aroma of my daughter's vape pen clung to the festive garlands like a cheap perfume, mocking the quiet dignity of the season. I stood in my kitchen, a place that had been the warm, beating heart of this family for 30 years, and felt a weariness that went bone deep. My hands, still strong, but mapped with the fine lines of 62 years, methodically kneaded dough for the morning cinnamon rolls. Outside, a gentle snow was beginning to fall, dusting the quiet suburban street in a blanket of pristine white. It was a picture-perfect Christmas Eve. But inside, I, Elena, the matriarch of this paid-off house, felt like a ghost haunting my own holiday. My daughter Jessica was the source of this profound, soul-crushing exhaustion. At 27, she was a magnificent, hollow creature. She was currently draped across my living room sofa, a place where her father, David, used to sit and read the paper every Sunday morning. She wasn't reading, she was curating. Her phone was held aloft, her face a perfectly contoured mask of manufactured bliss as she took a series of selfies. The beautifully decorated Christmas tree was nothing more than a calculated prop in the background of her performance. "Holiday vibes," she murmured to her unseen audience. Her voice was a low, seductive purr that felt utterly alien in this house of warm, honest emotions. Just relaxing and letting Mom handle all the hard work. Blessed Christmas Eve family time. I watched her from the kitchen doorway, a silent, invisible figure in my own home. She was a self-proclaimed content creator, a brand influencer, though the only brand she influenced was her own relentless, insatiable entitlement. Her life was a performance, and I was the unwilling, unpaid stage crew, the silent financial backer, and the weary in-house maid. This house, this solid brick two-story, was the culmination of a lifetime of hard work. David, a city bus driver for 40 years, and I, a registered nurse who had worked more double shifts than I could count, had poured our sweat, our savings, and our dreams into this place. We had paid it off 3 years before he passed, a moment of quiet, monumental triumph. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, my fortress of solitude in my retirement. Instead, it had become Jessica's flop house. She had moved back in after college with a vague promise to get on her feet. 5 years later, her feet were still firmly planted on my coffee table, usually clad in a pair of outrageously expensive designer sneakers that I had, in some indirect way, paid for. She did not have a job. She did not pay rent. She did not cook or clean or contribute in any meaningful way to the household. She simply existed. She consumed. She took up space, both physical and emotional, with the thoughtless, all-encompassing confidence of a black hole. My quiet, peaceful retirement had become a third shift, a new unpaid job as the caretaker and financier of my own adult child's prolonged adolescence. My patience, a quality I had honed over a lifetime of nursing, had been worn down to a dangerously thin, frayed thread. Every selfie she took, every discarded dish she left on the counter, every casual, entitled demand she made was another small, sharp snip at that thread. I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and heavy as the snow outside, that the thread was about to break. The breaking point, when it came, was not a loud, dramatic event. It was a quiet, heartbreaking discovery in a dusty corner of a forgotten room. I wiped the flour from my hands and moved toward the back of the house. I was searching for a specific box of ornaments, the delicate, hand-blown glass angels my own mother had given me, one for every year of my marriage to David. I kept them in his old office, a small wood-paneled room at the back of the house that had been his sanctuary. It was no longer his sanctuary. It was now Jessica's filming studio. I pushed the door open and was met with a scene of chaotic, creative squalor. Clothes were thrown over the armchair where David used to sit and balance his checkbook. Empty energy drink cans and takeout containers littered the floor. A large ring light, a stark, alien piece of equipment, stood in the center of the room like a malevolent, one-eyed god. I navigated the mess, my heart aching with a familiar mixture of frustration and profound, sorrowful grief. This room, which had always smelled of his old spice and the faint sweet scent of his pipe tobacco, now smelled of stale pizza and my daughter's cloying perfume. It was a desecration. I found the box of ornaments I was looking for on a shelf, but my eyes were drawn to another box tucked away in the corner, behind a pile of discarded shopping bags. It was a simple, sturdy cardboard box, one I recognized instantly. On the side, in David's neat, masculine script, was a single word: keepsakes. It was his memory box, the place where he had kept the small, sacred artifacts of his life, his service medals from his time in the Army, his 25-year safe driving award from the city, his father's old pocket watch, his favorite dog-eared copy of a James Baldwin novel. It was a box of profound, personal, and utterly irreplaceable value. And sitting on top of it, leaving a wet, circular stain on the cardboard, was a half-empty, sweating glass of what looked like white wine. A cold, sharp anger, colder and sharper than any I had felt before, pierced through my weary resignation. The sheer, casual disrespect of it, the thoughtless, callous desecration of this sacred object, was a violation of a magnitude that felt almost physical. With a trembling hand, I lifted the wine glass off the box and set it on the floor. I opened the dusty flaps. Everything seemed to be there at first glance. The medals, the watch, the book. But as I lifted out his old, worn leather wallet, something was missing. Tucked into one of the slots, he had always kept a small, plain gold ring. It was a simple band that his own father had worn. It wasn't flashy or particularly valuable in a monetary sense, but it was a piece of our history, a tangible link to a generation I had never known. It was gone. A frantic, cold panic began to well up in my chest. I searched the box, my hands shaking, moving aside the medals and the watch. It wasn't there. I checked the bottom of the box. Nothing. And then my fingers brushed against a small, crisp, folded piece of paper I didn't recognize, tucked under the lining. I pulled it out. It was a pawn shop receipt. It was dated 2 weeks prior. The item listed was 114K men's gold ring. The payout had been a paltry $150. I stared at the receipt, at the cold transactional evidence of my daughter's betrayal. The numbers blurred for a second, then sharpened into crystal clarity. $150? She had sold a piece of her grandfather's soul, a piece of her own heritage, for less than the cost of one of her sneakers. And the last frayed thread of my patience did not just snap, it vaporized. This was not just laziness. This was not just entitlement. This was theft. This was a violation of a magnitude so profound that it constituted a kind of spiritual violence. She had taken the legacy of a man who had worked himself to the bone for her, and she had sold it for pocket money. For what? A fancy dinner? A few more likes on a meaningless photograph? The heartbreak was a physical agony, a crushing weight on my chest. But then something shifted. The woman who had patiently endured, the mother who had always forgiven, The quiet, competent nurse who had spent her life cleaning up other people's messes. She died in that dusty, desecrated room. In her place, something new, something cold, and something utterly, unforgivingly resolute was born. I carefully folded the pawnshop receipt and put it in my pocket. It was the final piece of evidence I needed, the closing argument in a trial I had not even known I was conducting. The verdict was in, and the sentence was about to be carried out. I walked back into the living room, my movements slow and deliberate. My face was a carefully constructed mask of calm, hiding the storm raging inside me. A hurricane of grief, of rage, of a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical wound, was completely hidden. I was a nurse again, in the middle of a code blue. My emotions were locked away, my mind a cold, clear instrument of focused professional action. Jessica was still on the sofa, scrolling through her phone, completely oblivious to the seismic event that had just occurred in her filming studio. She was bathed in the warm, festive glow of the Christmas tree lights, a picture of serene, self-absorbed indolence. She looked up as I entered, but her eyes held no curiosity, no concern for my well-being. They held only annoyance. I was an intrusion, a background character who had just walked into her shot. "Mom." "Finally," she said, her voice a low, irritated sigh. She waved a dismissive hand at the room around her. The floor was littered with discarded wrapping paper from the gifts I had already placed under the tree. A few empty snack bags and a half-eaten plate of cookies sat on the coffee table. It was a small, festive, and entirely normal amount of holiday clutter. To Jessica, it was a scene of apocalyptic squalor. "Can you please clean this mess up?" she demanded, her voice not that of a daughter asking for help, but of a queen issuing a command to a slow-witted servant. "My friends are coming over in an hour for a little Christmas Eve party, and I'm not going to be embarrassed by this pigsty." I stood there, frozen. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her demand, coming just moments after my discovery of her monstrous, petty theft, was almost sublime in its villainy. She had sold her grandfather's ring for $150, and she was now worried about being embarrassed by a few stray pieces of wrapping paper. "I have a brand to maintain," she continued, examining her fingernails. Her brand. The brand of a young woman who lived a life of effortless, curated perfection. A life that was, in reality, a complete and utter fraud, subsidized by the quiet, relentless labor of the very woman she was now ordering to clean up her mess. I did not react. I did not scream. I did not pull the pawnshop receipt from my pocket and confront her with the evidence of her crime. To do so would have been to give her a scene, a drama, a confrontation she would have twisted and turned until she was the victim, the misunderstood daughter of a nagging, overbearing mother. I was done with her drama. I was done with her scenes. I was about to write a new final act, and it was going to be a quiet, elegant, and utterly devastating one. So I just stood there, my face a blank, unreadable mask. My silence, my lack of an immediate, compliant response, seemed to annoy her even further. "Well?" she snapped, finally looking up from her phone, her eyes cold and impatient. "Are you going to clean it, or are you just going to stand there?" And then, as if she had not already inflicted a mortal wound upon my soul, she delivered the final, casual, and most brutal blow of all. "Oh," she said, her voice a sudden, bright thought, as if she were just remembering a small item on a grocery list. "And I need $500. I stared at her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. $500 for party supplies," she explained, as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. "Drinks, some more snacks, the good kind, not that cheap stuff you buy. And just give me cash. It's easier." She wanted $500 in cash for a party. A party in my house, for which she was not paying rent. She wanted me, her personal ATM, to dispense the funds for her to entertain her friends. After she had just ordered me, her personal maid, to clean up the mess she had made. The calm that had settled over me was no longer just a decision. It was a state of being. The emotional part of my brain, the part that would have wept, that would have screamed, seemed to have been surgically removed. All that was left was the cold, clear, and utterly focused logic of a woman who has finally, definitively, and irrevocably had enough. This was the moment. The final straw had not just broken the camel's back. It had vaporized it. I looked at my daughter, at her beautiful, expectant, and utterly soulless face, and I smiled. It was a strange, serene smile, a smile she had seen 1,000 times before. It was the smile of her mother, the woman who always sighed, who always complained, but who, in the end, always gave in. She saw my smile, and she relaxed, the tension of her demand melting away, replaced by the smug, easy confidence of a bully who knows she has already won. She mistook my calm for her usual weary compliance. She had no idea that the woman standing before her was a stranger, a woman she had never met before. The Elena who would have argued, who would have sighed, who would have eventually, resentfully, opened her purse, was gone forever. "Of course, sweetheart," I said. My voice was a soft, gentle murmur, the very sound of maternal capitulation. "A party sounds lovely. You deserve to have some fun with your friends." The relief that flooded Jessica's face was a pathetic, disgusting thing. It was the relief of a parasite that has successfully latched back onto its host. Confident in its next meal, she immediately looked back down at her phone, her thumbs flying across the screen. Her attention was already shifting back to her own, more important world. I had been handled. The problem of her momentary lack of cash had been solved. I was once again relegated to my proper functional role as a background utility. I walked to the small secretary desk in the corner of the living room where I kept my purse. My movements were slow, deliberate, unhurried. Inside, I felt a strange, exhilarating sense of lightness, of freedom. The decision, once made, was a powerful, liberating thing. Every action I took now was no longer a reaction to her demands, but a proactive step in my own quiet, radical liberation. I opened the drawer. My checkbook lay there, the register a testament to years of meticulous, responsible accounting. Next to it was the small emergency stash I always kept in a plain white envelope. I took out my wallet and removed 5 crisp new $100 bills. The texture of the money felt different today. Usually, parting with this kind of cash for one of her frivolous whims would make my stomach churn with anxiety. I would calculate the hours of nursing shifts it represented, the groceries it could buy. Today, it felt like monopoly money. It was no longer savings. It was an exit fee. I walked back to the sofa and held the bills out to her. "Here you go, honey," I said. She didn't even look up. She simply held out her hand, her eyes still glued to the screen of her phone. I placed the money in her perfectly manicured palm. Her fingers closed around it with the reflexive, unthinking greed of a Venus flytrap. "Thanks, Mom," she mumbled. The words were a thoughtless, automatic response. The transaction was complete. It was not the act of a mother giving her daughter money for a party. It was a final severance payment. It was the last withdrawal she would ever make from the Bank of Elena. I stood there for a second, watching her count the bills. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just to be sure. She nodded, satisfied, and stuffed them into the pocket of her designer jeans. "You know," I said, my voice a little weak, a little tired, A perfect final touch to my performance of the weary, defeated mother. I think I'm feeling a little worn out from all the baking. I don't think I'm up for a party tonight. Yeah, you do that, she said. Her voice was a dismissive, uninterested wave of her hand. My desire to retreat, to be absent from her party, was not a disappointment to her. It was a relief. The old, embarrassing mother would be safely out of sight, not cramping her style, not interfering with her performance for her cool, trendy friends. You kids have fun, I said, my voice a soft maternal whisper. I turned and walked out of the living room, my back straight, my steps steady. I did not look back. I walked down the hall to my bedroom, the small, quiet sanctuary at the back of the house that had been my only refuge for the past few years. I closed the door behind me. The sound was a soft, definitive click. The performance was over. The stage was now hers for one final, glorious night. She had the money. She had the house. She had everything she wanted. She had no idea that she was the guest of honor at a going-away party, and that the person who was leaving forever was me. In the quiet, cloistered sanctuary of my bedroom, I did not lie down. I did not rest. The weariness I had projected was a lie, a perfect piece of camouflage. In its place was a surge of pure, cold, and focused energy. It was the kind of adrenaline rush I hadn't felt since my early days as a nurse, working in the chaos of the emergency room. A crisis was unfolding, but this time, I was not the one responding to it. I was the one creating it. I sat on the edge of my bed. The familiar floral quilt was a strange, tactile link to a life that was already in my past. My mind flashed back to 3 months ago, the day the plan had truly begun. I was in the sterile, gray office of the bank manager, a man named Mr. Henderson, who wore a tie that was too wide and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You want to stop the automatic payments?" he had asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Mrs. Vance, your mortgage is paid off. You only have the home equity line of credit open. The payments are minimal. Is there a financial difficulty?" No difficulty. I had lied, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to hide the tremor. "I just want to handle the payments manually from now on. I prefer writing checks." "I see," he said, typing into his computer. "Well, it's your choice, but be careful. If you miss 3 cycles, the system automatically triggers the foreclosure protocol. It's aggressive." "I understand," I said. I understood perfectly. That was the point. I had walked out of the bank that day and thrown the payment book into the trash can outside. It had felt like a betrayal of everything David and I had worked for. We were people who paid our bills. We were people who took pride in our credit score. But Sarah had been adamant. "It's the only way, Elena," she had told me on the phone that night. "If you just kick her out, she'll claim tenants' rights. She'll drag you through the courts for months. But if the bank forecloses, if the house is no longer yours, she has no legal leg to stand on. We have to create a situation where the house itself is the enemy, not you." So I had done it. I had stopped paying, and for the past 3 months, the letters had been coming. First, the polite reminders, then the sterner warnings. Finally, the formal legal notices of intent to foreclose. They arrived in their stark, official-looking envelopes. Each one was a small paper heart attack, but I was the one who collected the mail every day. Jessica, in her self-absorbed world, probably didn't even know where our mailbox was. I had been intercepting the letters, hiding them, building a quiet paper trail of our impending, manufactured doom. I pulled the latest letter from my nightstand drawer. The bold red text at the top was final. Notice of sale. I placed it next to the pawn shop receipt on the bedspread. 2 pieces of paper. One represented her betrayal, the other represented my retribution. The loop was closed. I took out my phone. I had only one call to make, the call that would set the entire carefully planned demolition in motion. I scrolled to the single contact I had saved under ice. My little joke, in case of emergency. My sister, Sarah. Sarah was my opposite in almost every way. Where I was patient, she was blunt. Where I was weary, she was a ball of ferocious, proactive energy. She was a sharp, successful real estate agent, a woman who understood the cold-hearted and unsentimental language of contracts and consequences. She had been watching my situation with Jessica with a growing, simmering alarm for years. Her advice was always the same. Cut the cord, Elena. For God's sake, cut the cord before she bleeds you dry. I had always resisted, always made excuses, but now I was finally ready to take her advice. She answered on the first ring, her voice crisp and businesslike as always. Sarah here. It's me, I said, my voice a low, quiet thing. It's time. There was a brief, loaded pause on her end. She did not ask for details. She did not ask if I was sure. She knew the years of frustration, of heartbreak, that were packed into those two small words. I was waiting for your call, she said, her voice now the low, efficient hum of a general who has just been given the order to advance. The team is on standby. I can have the truck there by 2 a.m. Are you absolutely sure about this, Elena? Once we start, there's no going back. Her question was not a challenge. It was a final, necessary check. She needed to know that my resolve was absolute, that this wasn't another moment of weary frustration, but a final, irrevocable decision. I looked at the pawnshop receipt still sitting on the bed. $150. I'm sure, Sarah, I said, and my voice was as steady and as solid as a block of granite. She sold David's ring. What? Sarah's voice dropped an octave. The gold band, from his father. She pawned it 2 weeks ago. That little... Sarah began a string of creative, furious curses that was her own unique love language. She cut herself off abruptly. Okay, that's it. That is all I needed to hear. The plan is active, she said, her voice now cold, hard, and utterly focused. I'll be there at 1:30 to help you with the personal items. The crew will arrive at 2. We'll be out by 5. Are you ready? I'm ready, I said. I had never been more ready for anything in my life. We hung up, and I sat there in the quiet of my room, the architect of a secret, life-altering plan that was about to be executed with swift military precision. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was a carefully planned, long-term exit strategy, a code-red protocol that Sarah and I had been quietly, methodically building for the past 3 months. While I was strategically defaulting on the house, I was also quietly, methodically moving all my liquid assets, my pension checks, my Social Security, and the substantial savings and investment accounts that Jessica knew nothing about. I had liquidated a portion of them and transferred the cash to a new private account at a different bank, an account my daughter's name was nowhere near. I was making myself a financial ghost, erasing the very money trail that Jessica had, for so long, followed like a hungry wolf. And then there was the safe harbor. 2 months ago, Sarah had found me the perfect place. It was a small, beautiful 2-bedroom condo in a quiet, upscale retirement community on the other side of Raleigh. I remembered the day I bought it. I had visited it on a clandestine afternoon while Jessica had been at a networking brunch with her influencer friends. Stepping into it for the first time had been like stepping into a different dimension. The air was cool and still, the silence broken only by the faint, distant click of a golf ball being struck. The light was different, a soft, clean, and unobscured light that streamed through the large, spotless windows. My house, the house I was about to leave, was a place of shadows and memories. It was full of the ghosts of the past and the crushing weight of the present. But the condo was a blank slate. It was a masterpiece of quiet, understated elegance. The kitchen was a small, efficient jewel box of gleaming new appliances, a space designed for the pleasure of cooking for one, not the relentless, thankless labor of feeding a family. The living room had a small balcony that overlooked the 18th green of the golf course. The master bedroom was a sanctuary of calm with a spa-like bathroom that had a bathtub adequate enough to soak away a lifetime of weariness. I had paid for it in cash. The feeling of signing those closing documents, of owning this new, clean, uncomplicated space outright, had been a quiet, revolutionary act. It was a declaration that my resources, my fortune, the fruits of my life's labor were now going to be used for one purpose and one purpose only: my own comfort, my own security, my own peace. The foreclosure on my old house, the ticking time bomb I had set months ago, was now just a few short weeks away from its final legal detonation. The bank would repossess the house, and Jessica would be evicted by a faceless bureaucratic entity. It was the perfect, blameless crime. Suddenly, a vibration ran through the floorboards, a low, rhythmic thumping. The music. It started just after 9 p.m., a violent intrusion into the quiet suburban night. The bass was heavy, a dull, vibrating pressure against my skull. I walked to my bedroom door and cracked it open an inch. The high-pitched squeals of Jessica's friends drifted down the hall. They sounded like a flock of brightly plumed, chattering birds. "Oh my God, Jess! This place is huge!" one voice shrieked. "Right? It's old, but whatever. It's free." Jessica's voice floated back, dismissive and cool. "Just don't go in the back rooms. Mom's hoarding junk in there." I closed the door. Let them laugh. Let them dance. The team was on standby. After an hour of the self-imposed exile, I knew I had to make an appearance. My complete absence would be noted. It would be strange. It would be a crack in the facade of the weary, compliant mother I was so carefully trying to project. I had to play my part until the very end. I took a deep breath, smoothed the front of my simple housecoat, and opened my bedroom door. The wall of sound and energy that hit me was a physical force. The house had been transformed. The lights were dimmed. A few colored bulbs I didn't even know we owned were casting a lurid club-like glow on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of cheap, sweet cocktails, my daughter's fruity vape smoke, and a dozen different clashing perfumes. My living room, my sanctuary of quiet, comfortable elegance, was now a crowded, chaotic nightclub. A dozen of Jessica's friends, all of them a variation on her own theme of performative, self-absorbed glamour, were draped over my furniture. They were loud, their laughter a series of sharp, brain-piercing shrieks. They were a flock of beautifully dressed, utterly vacuous parasites, and they were feeding on my home. Jessica was at the center of it all, of course, the queen bee in her hive. She was holding a large plastic cup of some bright blue concoction, a triumphant, proprietary smile on her face. She saw me emerge from the hallway, and her smile didn't falter. She did not see her mother. She saw a servant. "Mom, there you are," she shouted over the music, her voice a sharp, commanding thing. "We're almost out of ice. Can you get some more from the freezer in the garage?" It was not a request. It was an order, and it was delivered in front of her entire watching court. It was a public demonstration of her power, of her dominance in this house. I just nodded, my face a blank, unreadable mask, and turned toward the kitchen. As I passed, one of her friends, a young woman with a face full of fillers and an expression of profound, bored indifference, looked me up and down. "Is that your mom?" she asked Jessica, her voice a loud, disdainful whisper. She's like your little house elf." Jessica and her friends erupted in a fresh wave of cruel, dismissive laughter. A house elf. A small, magical, and utterly subservient creature who exists only to serve. The accuracy of the insult was a fresh, sharp twist of the knife in my already bleeding heart, but I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. House elf, I thought. Just you wait. This house elf is about to set herself free. I went to the kitchen. It was a war zone. Empty liquor bottles, spilled mixers, and overflowing bags of chips littered the counters I had so carefully cleaned just a few hours before. A sticky red punch of some kind had been spilled on my clean white floor, and no one had bothered to wipe it up. My feet stuck slightly with every step. I filled the ice bucket, my movements slow and mechanical. I walked back into the living room and placed it on the bar Jessica had set up on my antique sideboard. She didn't thank me. She didn't even acknowledge me. I stood there for a moment on the periphery of their loud, bright, and utterly alien world, and I watched. I watched as they danced on my Persian rug, their sharp heels a potential death sentence to its delicate, hand-woven fibers. I watched as one of them, in a fit of drunken exuberance, knocked over a small framed photograph of David from the mantelpiece. It fell with a sharp clatter, the glass cracking. The girl looked down, giggled, and kicked it under the sofa with the toe of her boot. She didn't even pause her dancing. I watched as my daughter, my beautiful, monstrous daughter, presided over the desecration of my home, her face alight with a feverish, narcissistic joy. And in that moment, the last lingering vestiges of my maternal guilt, of my fear that I was being too cruel, too harsh, were completely and utterly incinerated. This was not a child who deserved another chance. This was a parasite that was killing its host. And my act of self-preservation was not an act of cruelty. It was a necessary and long overdue act of survival. I turned and walked back to my room. The sound of their careless laughter followed me down the hall. Let them have their party. Let them have their final, glorious, and utterly oblivious night, in the house they believed was theirs. The bill for their arrogance was coming due, and the collection was scheduled for 2:01 a.m. I lay on my bed, fully dressed, the sound of the thumping bass a dull, vibrating pressure against my skull. I did not sleep. I waited. At around 1:30 in the morning, the sounds began to change. The music grew more sporadic. The loud, sharp shrieks of laughter were replaced by the lower, more slurry sounds of drunken goodbyes. Car doors slammed, engines revved, and then, slowly, a substantial, profound silence began to settle over the house. A silence broken only by the sound of Jessica stumbling down the hallway to her bedroom and the loud, definitive click of her door shutting. The parasite was fed, and it was now in its cocoon. The house was finally, mercifully quiet. I waited another 30 minutes, every second stretching into an eternity. I had to be sure she was completely, soundly, and unwakeably asleep. Finally, at 2:00 a.m. sharp, I saw the faint, sweeping glow of headlights through my window as a large vehicle pulled silently into my driveway. It was time. I slipped out of my room, my heart a quiet, frantic drum against my ribs. I moved through the dark, silent house, a ghost in my own home. The living room was a scene of utter drunken devastation. Red plastic cups, crushed chip bags, and sticky spills littered every surface. It smelled of stale beer and regret. The mess that Jessica had so arrogantly demanded I clean was now a monument to her own destructive carelessness. I went to the front door and unlocked it. Standing on the porch, a silent, formidable figure in the cold pre-dawn air, was my sister, Sarah. She was dressed in practical dark clothes, her face set in a look of grim, focused determination. She was not my sister tonight. She was my general, my co-conspirator, my getaway driver. "Ready, Elena?" she whispered, her voice a low, efficient hum. "More than ready," I whispered back. Behind her, a large unmarked moving truck was parked in the driveway, its engine off, its presence a large, dark, and powerful promise. The back of the truck was already open. 3 figures, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in dark work clothes, emerged from the cab and walked silently toward us. They were the team, a crew from a discreet, after-hours moving company that Sarah used for her high-end real estate clients. "Okay," Sarah said, her voice a low, commanding whisper to the crew. "You know the plan. We have 3 hours. Personal effects, furniture, all kitchen contents, and all food. Nothing in the daughter's room is to be touched. Everything else goes. Let's move." The execution began. It was a work of breathtaking, silent efficiency. The crew moved through my house like a team of black ops soldiers. Their movements were swift, sure, and almost completely soundless. They did not speak. They communicated with hand signals. Every piece of furniture was wrapped in heavy, sound-dampening blankets before it was moved. Every box was packed with a quiet, purposeful precision. Sarah was the director, pointing to a room, gesturing to a piece of furniture, a silent, formidable conductor of this symphony of disassembly. My role was to pack the small, personal, and most precious things. I went from room to room, a silent, weeping ghost, gathering the artifacts of my life. I took the photos from the walls, carefully wrapping each one in paper. The wedding photos, the baby pictures of a son I had lost, and a daughter who was now a stranger. I took the books from the shelves, the music from the stereo cabinet. I took the small, worn Bible from my nightstand, the one my own mother had given me. I was not just packing up a house, I was packing up a life. One of the movers, a burly man with gentle hands, lifted the sofa Jessica had been lounging on just hours before. He tilted it to get it through the door. A shower of loose change and a bright pink vape pen fell from the cushions, hitting the hardwood floor with a series of sharp clacks. We all froze. Eyes darted toward the hallway leading to Jessica's room. Silence. The mover looked at me, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. I nodded. He continued, stepping over the vape pen as if it were a piece of trash on the street. It was. We moved to the dining room, the table where we had eaten Christmas dinners for 30 years, the chairs where David had sat, gone, wrapped, loaded. In 45 minutes, the living room and dining room were empty shells. The rugs were rolled up, revealing the bare, cold hardwood beneath. The lamps, the curtains, the small decorative objects that had transformed the structure of wood and brick into a home, all gone. The house began to feel different. It grew colder, emptier. The familiar, comfortable acoustics were gone, replaced by a sharp, hollow echo. My own footsteps, which had been softened by rugs and furniture, now clicked with a loud, lonely sound on the bare floors. The house was being stripped of its soul, and I was the one holding the scalpel. But the heart of the house still remained. The kitchen. I looked at Sarah. She checked her watch. "Kitchen," she whispered. "Let's gut it." The kitchen was our primary target. "Clean this mess," Jessica had demanded. The words echoed in my mind, bouncing off the stainless steel appliances. A cruel, casual command that had become the unintentional mantra for my own liberation. And so, we cleaned. We started with the pantry. We didn't just take a few items. We took everything. Sarah opened a large cardboard box, and I began to sweep the shelves. The bags of flour and sugar I just bought for my holiday baking went first. The rows of canned goods I kept for emergencies, green beans, tomatoes, soup, clattered into the box. Then came the specific expensive items Jessica demanded I stock. The jar of artisan almond butter she insisted on for her smoothies. The box of gluten-free organic crackers she liked to snack on while scrolling TikTok. I held the box of crackers for a moment, feeling the weight of the $8 price tag I had paid without complaint. I looked at the trash can. "No," Sarah said gently, taking the box from my hand and placing it in the donation pile. "We don't waste, Elena. We just relocate." We stripped the shelves of the pasta, the jars of spices, the bottles of aged balsamic vinegar and olive oil. Every single edible item was packed. It was a systematic stripping away of the very concept of sustenance from this house. Next was the refrigerator. It was a particularly satisfying and particularly brutal act. We emptied it completely. The carton of milk, the dozen eggs, the leftover turkey from a pre-holiday meal, the condiments in the door, the frozen vegetables in the freezer. We left nothing. Not a single lonely ice cube in the tray. I took a rag and wiped the shelves clean, leaving a pristine, sterile, and utterly empty white box. For 27 years, this appliance had been the source of my daughter's unending, unearned nourishment. It was the magic box that refilled itself. I closed the door. The well was now officially dry. We moved on to the drawers and the cabinets. We packed every piece of silverware, every dish, every glass. The pots and pans David had bought me for our 10th anniversary. I reached into the back of the utensil drawer and pulled out the worn wooden rolling pin. It had been my grandmother's. The wood was smooth and dark from decades of flour and butter, and hands pressing love into dough. These were not just objects. They were the tools of my lifelong service to this family, the instruments of my love, and I was reclaiming them. I was taking back my labor, my care, my very identity as the nurturer of this home. "That's the last of it," one of the movers whispered, taping a box shut with a sharp right-eep that sounded like a bandage being torn off. I looked around. The counters were vast, empty expanses of gleaming, sterile granite. The cabinets were all slightly ajar, revealing their empty, cavernous interiors. The kitchen was now a clean, empty, and utterly soulless space. "One last thing," I said to Sarah. I looked around for a piece of paper, a pen, something to write my final parting message on. But there was nothing. We had taken it all. The notepads by the phone, the pens from the junk drawer. They were all packed away in a box in the back of a moving truck on their way to a new life. The only paper left in the entire house was a roll of paper towel sitting on the empty counter. It was a fitting, almost poetic piece of stationery for my final act as this home's caretaker. I tore off a single, clean sheet. I found a black permanent marker that had rolled under the sink, an oversight in our otherwise perfect purge. I uncapped the marker. The smell of the ink was sharp and chemical. With a hand that was as steady and sure as a surgeon's, I wrote the note. The words were simple, clear, and utterly devastatingly brutal. I did not write of my love or my pain or my disappointment. This was not an emotional letter. This was a final transactional invoice for a lifetime of ingratitude. I wrote, "You wanted the house? It's all yours. The foreclosure notice is in the mail." That was it. 2 short, clean sentences that contained the full, catastrophic truth of her new reality. The house was hers, just as she had always believed it should be. But it was not a gift. It was a burden. It was an empty, failing asset, a massive, looming debt that was about to come crashing down upon her. I walked to the silent, empty refrigerator and took a single small magnet that had been left behind, a cheap promotional magnet from a local plumber. I used it to stick the paper towel to the center of the refrigerator door. It hung there, a stark white flag of surrender, a final damning proclamation in the heart of the empty, lifeless home. "Elena," Sarah whispered from the hallway, "it's 5 yen a.m. We have to go." I capped the marker. I left it on the counter. My surgery was complete. By 5 a.m., the work was done. The last box had been loaded, the last piece of furniture shrouded and secured in the back of the moving truck. The professional crew, their work completed with a silent, ghostly efficiency, climbed back into the cab of their truck. They gave Sarah a single professional nod, started the engine with a low, rumbling cough, and pulled away into the dark, pre-dawn stillness. The first and largest part of my old life was now officially on its way to my new one. Sarah and I stood on the porch, watching the red taillights of the truck disappear down the quiet, snow-dusted street. The air was cold and clean, and the world was utterly, profoundly silent. "It's done," she said softly, putting an arm around my trembling shoulders. "It's done," I repeated. The words were a hollow echo in the vast empty space that had once been my life. We walked back inside to do the final check. The house that greeted us was a stranger. It was a cold, cavernous, and unsettling place. The familiar, comfortable landscape of my home had been replaced by a stark, barren moonscape. The living room, which had been the scene of so much life, of so much laughter, and of so much recent ugly chaos, was now just a large empty box. The only light came from the single bare bulb of the foyer chandelier, which cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. The walls themselves were a patchwork of pale, ghostly rectangles and squares, the clean, unfaded spots where our family photos and my favorite paintings had hung for decades. They were like architectural ghosts, the outlines of a life that had been hastily and violently erased. Our footsteps echoed with a loud, lonely hollowness on the bare hardwood floors. The house, stripped of its soft furnishings, its rugs, its curtains, had lost its voice. It no longer absorbed sound. It amplified it, reflecting our own small human sounds back at us with a cold, indifferent clarity. We walked down the hallway toward the bedrooms. The only room that remained untouched was Jessica's. I stood in the doorway and cracked it open one last time. I looked in. It was a scene of pure, self-absorbed chaos. A child's messy playroom frozen in time. Clothes were strewn on the floor, makeup was scattered across the dresser, and the bed was a tangled mess of sheets. In the center of it all, my daughter slept, a peaceful, oblivious princess, in the middle of her own self-created squalor. Her room, once a symbol of her parasitic presence in my home, was now an island. It was a small, isolated pocket of her own reality, completely cut off from the devastating new world that was waiting for her just outside her door. I watched the rise and fall of her chest. I didn't feel hate. I didn't feel love. I felt distance. She was already a memory, a problem I had solved. I closed her door gently, a final, quiet act of quarantine. The house was no longer a home. It was a stage set for a single, final, and devastating scene. It was a hollowed-out structure, a ghost of its former self, a perfect physical metaphor for the hollow, empty relationship I had shared with the young woman who was now the last sleeping inhabitant of this empty, echoing shell. My work was almost done. There was just one last prop to place. I walked back to the kitchen counter. The granite was cold under my fingertips. I took the set of house keys from my pocket. The keys that had been a symbol of my ownership, my responsibility, my burden for 30 years. I placed them on the bare, cold granite. Clink. They made a small, lonely metallic sound in the vast, echoing silence. I had cleaned the mess. I had given her the cash, and now I had given her the house. My part of the bargain was complete. "Okay," I said to Sarah, my voice clear and steady. "I'm ready now." I walked out of the front door of the house I had called home for my entire adult life. I did not look back. I got into the passenger seat of my sister's warm, waiting car. The seat heater was on, a small, luxurious comfort that felt like a hug. Sarah put the car in gear. She pulled out of the driveway just as the first pale and hopeful rays of Christmas morning began to streak the eastern sky. Behind us, the house stood silent and dark, a tomb waiting for its occupant to wake up. Jessica woke up to the sound of silence. It was a silence so profound, so absolute, that it was the first thing that penetrated the thick, syrupy fog of her champagne-induced hangover. There was no gentle morning murmur of her mother in the kitchen. There was no scent of coffee brewing. No sound of the television playing the Christmas morning parade. There was just nothing. She groaned, her head a throbbing, painful drum. She rolled over in her bed, her hand fumbling for the phone on her nightstand. The screen was a bright, painful glare. It was almost noon. She had slept for 10 hours, a deep, drunken, and utterly oblivious sleep. "Mom," she called out, her voice a hoarse, croaking thing. "Is there any coffee?" The only response was the faint, hollow echo of her own voice in the silent house. "Annoying," she muttered. Her default emotional state began to prickle through the haze of her headache. Where was she? Had she gone out for a last-minute errand? It was Christmas morning, for God's sake. Her mother was supposed to be here, catering to her needs, providing the comforting, familiar backdrop to her holiday. With a substantial, frustrated sigh, Jessica swung her legs out of bed. The floor was cold, colder than usual. The air in her room had a strange, chilly draft. She stumbled out of her bedroom and into the hallway, her eyes still blurry, her mind still clouded. "Mom!" she called again, her voice louder, more demanding. Silence. She walked into the living room and she stopped dead. The sight that greeted her was so bizarre, so incomprehensible, that her hungover brain simply could not process it. The room was empty, not just tidy, not just clean. Empty. The large, comfortable sofa was gone. The armchairs were gone. The coffee table, the television, the large, vibrant rug. It was all gone. The Christmas tree, which had been the centerpiece of her triumphant selfies just last night, was also gone. The only things left were a few stray, sad-looking pine needles on the bare hardwood floor. She stared, her mouth hanging open, a low, confused sound escaping her lips. "What the—" She stumbled from room to room, her panic growing with every empty doorway she passed through. The dining room was a cavernous, empty space. The long, polished table and chairs had vanished. The family room was a hollow shell. It was as if she had woken up in a different house, a strange, empty, and unsettling parallel universe. Her panic finally propelled her into the kitchen, the one place that was always the warm, beating heart of the home. And there, the full, catastrophic scope of the situation finally crashed down upon her. The kitchen was a sterile, white, and utterly empty void. The counters were bare. The cabinets were all slightly ajar, revealing their empty, mocking interiors. And the refrigerator. The refrigerator was a silent, white tomb. Its door was also slightly ajar, a final, definitive statement of his own profound emptiness. She was alone in an empty house on Christmas morning. There were no presents. There was no food. There was no coffee. Her mother was gone. Everything was gone. And then she saw it. A single stark white piece of paper stuck to the front of the empty refrigerator with a cheap plastic magnet. She walked toward it, her movements slow and robotic, as if in a dream. She reached out a trembling hand and pulled the paper towel from the door. She read the two short, simple and utterly devastating sentences written in her mother's familiar, neat script. You wanted the house? It's all yours. The foreclosure notice is in the mail. The words on the paper towel were a language she didn't fully understand, but the menace behind them was crystal clear. Foreclosure. It was a word from a different world, a world of financial failure and adult consequences, a world she had never had to inhabit. But the first part of the note, the part that was a direct, chilling echo of her own entitled demands, she understood perfectly. You wanted the house. It's all yours. A wave of pure, cold, and absolute terror washed over her, a terror she had never before experienced in her entire pampered life. The house was not a gift. It was a trap. It was an empty, echoing, and apparently failing asset. Her first instinct was to call her mother, to scream, to demand an explanation, to bully her into reversing this insane, monstrous act. She snatched her phone from her pocket and frantically dialed my number, the number that had always been her lifeline, her get-out-of-jail-free card. The call went straight to a cold, impersonal, and utterly final recorded message. The number you have dialed has been disconnected or is no longer in service. Blocked. A new, sharper spike of panic pierced through her hungover haze. Her mother had not just left. She had vanished. She had erased herself from her life. Her next call was to her Aunt Sarah. Sarah, her sharp, no-nonsense aunt, who always looked at her with thinly veiled disapproval. Sarah would know something. Sarah would fix this. The result was the same. A disconnected number. Blocked. The walls of her world were closing in with a terrifying speed. The two adults in her life, the two pillars of the system that had always supported her, had simultaneously ceased to exist. She was completely and utterly on her own. She began to pace the empty, echoing living room, her mind a frantic, chaotic whirlwind. This had to be a joke, a sick, twisted, and incredibly cruel joke. Her mother was trying to teach her a lesson. She would be back. She had to be back. She would come back in a few hours with groceries and a lecture, and life would return to normal. But as the hours ticked by, and the silence in the empty house grew more intense and more profound, a new, more terrible reality began to sink in. This was not a joke. This was not a temporary lesson. This was a permanent amputation. Her phone, her only link to the outside world, became her desperate, futile weapon. She began to call her friends, the flock of glamorous, fair-weather companions who had so eagerly consumed her mother's liquor just last night. The conversations were a series of small, humiliating, and thoroughly educational deaths. "Hey, girl," she would say, her voice a high, frantic, and utterly false imitation of her usual casual cool. Craziest thing. My mom, totally cleared out the house as a surprise Christmas renovation. So silly. Anyway, the place is a mess. Can I come crash with you for a few days? The excuses were polite but firm. Oh my God, Jess, that's insane. I'd love to, but my own family is all here. There's literally no room. Aw, sweetie, that's wild. We're actually just heading out of town to go to my fiancé's parents' place. So sorry. They offered sympathy. They offered exclamations of shock, but none of them offered a solution. None of them offered a place to stay. Her friends, she was beginning to realize, were not friends at all. They were an audience. And the show, her show of a glamorous, effortless life, had just been catastrophically and very publicly canceled. As the afternoon light began to fade, a new, more primal fear began to set in. The house was cold, unnaturally cold. She went to the thermostat and tried to turn up the heat. Nothing happened. She tried to turn on a light. Nothing. The power was out. She stared at the dead light switch, and the full, horrifying, and absolute scope of her mother's quiet, meticulous, and utterly devastating revenge finally crashed down upon her. Her mother hadn't just taken the furniture and the food. She had cut the power. She had turned off the heat. She had plunged her into a world of cold, dark, and hungry silence. The house was no longer a home. It was a tomb, and she was trapped inside it, a ghost in the wreckage of a life she had not built and had no idea how to fix. The foreclosure notice was no longer a vague, abstract threat. It was a very real and very cold reality. The darkness that fell upon the house that Christmas evening was a complete and total thing. It was not the gentle, festive darkness of a quiet suburban street, punctuated by the cheerful glow of Christmas lights. It was a stark, profound, and terrifying blackness, the kind that exists only when a house has been completely severed from the grid of civilization. Jessica was now trapped in a cold, dark, and utterly silent prison of her own making. The phone in her hand, her only link to the outside world, was her last, most precious resource. The battery was at 10% and falling. Her phone battery died. The last small, glowing rectangle of light in her dark world winked out, and she was left in absolute, total, and complete darkness. There was no fade to black. It was instant. One moment, she had a lifeline, a connection to the digital world where she was a queen. The next, she was holding a dead piece of glass and metal in a tomb. She sat on the edge of her bed, the silence of the house pressing against her ears like water deep under water. The week that followed Christmas was a brutal, accelerated education in the realities of a world that did not revolve around Jessica. The cold, dark night in the empty house was her rock bottom, but the climb out was a slow, humiliating, and necessary one. She spent that first night huddled under her designer duvet, shivering in the raw, creeping cold that the walls of the house could no longer keep out. She had never known that a house without heat isn't just cool. It's dead. The air grows stagnant. The damp settles into the drywall. The structure itself seems to resent you. For the first time in her 27 years, Jessica was forced to sit in the dark with nothing but her own thoughts. There were no likes to count, no comments to read, no filters to apply. There was just the cold, hard truth of who she was when the lights went out. She wasn't an influencer. She wasn't a brand. She was a dependent. She realized, in the shivering dark, that her mother hadn't just been a roommate or a nuisance. I had been her infrastructure. I was the power grid. I was the water supply. I was the bank. I was the foundation upon which she had built her flimsy cardboard castle of entitlement. And I had pulled the plug. She didn't sleep. She waited for the sun. When the gray, cold light of morning finally filtered through the blinds, Jessica emerged from the house. She looked like a survivor of a localized apocalypse. Her hair was matted, her makeup smeared, her expensive clothes wrinkled and smelling of stale perfume and fear. She walked across the frozen lawn to the neighbor's house. Mrs. Higgins, a kind, middle-aged woman who had always been more of a friend to me than to my daughter. I had prepared Mrs. Higgins. I had called her 2 days before the move. "She's going to come to you," I had told her. "She's going to be hungry, and she's going to be scared. Feed her. Let her charge her phone. But do not let her stay." Mrs. Higgins opened the door. She saw the shivering, broken girl on her porch. She took her in. She gave her a warm bowl of oatmeal and a charger. And then when Jessica, warmed and recharged, began to hint about the spare bedroom, about staying for a few days until Mom calms down, Mrs. Higgins delivered the message I had left for her. She slid a piece of paper across the kitchen table. It wasn't an invitation. It was a phone number for a local women's shelter. "Your mother called, Jessica," Mrs. Higgins said gently but firmly. She said you might need this. I can drive you there, or I can call you a cab, but you can't stay here. The rejection was polite, but it was absolute. The lesson had to be a complete one. Jessica was no longer entitled to the comfort and care of a family home, not mine and not anyone else's. She was on her own. A few days later, the final official blow landed. The foreclosure notice arrived in the mail, a stark legal document addressed to me, but its contents were now entirely her problem. 2 days after that, a large, unignorable sign was hammered into the front lawn. Foreclosure sale, bank owned. Its bold red letters were a public declaration of the house's, and by extension, her own failure. The last time I heard of her, she was standing on the curb of my old street, the street where she had grown up in a world of warmth, comfort, and unearned privilege. She had 2 oversized designer suitcases at her feet, filled with the useless, flashy artifacts of her former life. She was waiting for one of her party friends, the only one who had finally, begrudgingly, agreed to help, to give her a ride. She wasn't going to a luxury condo. She wasn't going to a hotel. She was heading to a shared apartment on the other side of town, a cramped walk-up with 2 roommates, and the prospect of her first ever real entry-level job. The house was gone. The brand was gone. The entire illusory world of Jessica the influencer was gone for good. Meanwhile, my own new world was just beginning. New Year's Day brunch was a quiet, peaceful affair. It was just me and Sarah in my beautiful, new, and blissfully manageable condo. The sun streamed through the large, clean windows, glinting off the crystal glasses of our mimosas. The air smelled not of old resentments and new vape flavors, but of fresh coffee, sizzling bacon, and the promise of a quiet, uncomplicated day. We sat on my small balcony, a comfortable, companionable silence between us. Below us, the golf course was a pristine, rolling expanse of green, a landscape of manicured adult peace. "Have you heard from her?" Sarah asked finally, her voice gentle. "Not a word," I said. And it was the truth. My phone had been silent. No demands, no crises, no drama. "And I don't expect to," I added. "Not for a long time." "Do you think—" Sarah began, then trailed off, swirling the orange juice in her glass. "Do I think she's learned her lesson?" I finished for her. I took a slow sip of my mimosa and considered the question. I thought about the empty house. I thought about the cold. I thought about the sign on the lawn. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe, but that's not my problem anymore. My job was to raise her. I did that. The person she chooses to be now, that's on her." A sense of profound, liberating peace washed over me. It was a feeling I had not truly felt in years. The constant low-grade hum of responsibility, of guilt, of the heavy, unspoken burden of my own child's future was finally, blessedly silent. I looked around my new home. There was no clutter. There was no noise. There was just light. I raised my glass, the sunlight catching the bubbles, making them dance like tiny, joyful stars. I looked out at the peaceful green expanse of my new life, a life that was finally, completely, and utterly my own. And I thought of David, the man who had worked so hard beside me to build a life, a home, a foundation. He had always been the one to say that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them feel the full, unvarnished weight of their own choices. I raised my glass a little higher, a silent toast to him, to his memory, to his quiet, simple wisdom. "I finally did it, honey," I whispered to the clear blue and beautifully empty sky. "I finally cleaned up the mess." If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.